friendship, like virtue, is active. You got to work on it. It is a kind of work. And he contrasts that with benevolence, which he describes as inactive. It's the choices you make and the actions you perform is what forms you as a human being. Homonoia is an agreement that citizens share of kind of the fundamental matters of the direction of what their political community ought to do. Liberal democracies don't have much leisure. Aristotle's point is that it's very fundamental to what political activity is about, what life in a community is about. If all you're doing is preparing for war, or all you're doing is having rest so that you can prepare for Monday to work, that's not leisure. If you don't know how to rest, and if you're always preparing for work or preparing for war, Aristotle says that's a recipe for degeneration and empire.
Concepts with Shawn.
So just this last week, I saw a video on X, on social media, of an ambulance in downtown Toronto that was stopped and turned around by police so that it could avoid a protest, a pro-Palestine protest, blocking the intersection. This has really bothered me. I strongly believe that if we aren't standing up for the most vulnerable people in our society, we're doing something wrong. Canada has somehow lost the plot. We've lost the moral high ground. And so to try to unpack this, I invited Professor John von Heyking back. He's chair of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Lethbridge. One of his particular areas of interest has to do with friendship as a political virtue. And he defines friendship in a political sense as, quote, he says it involves hearts and minds united about common fundamental matters, end quote. And so I wanted to press John on whether he thought we could even have a proper country, a functioning country, if we didn't have some degree of political friendship, or at least political friendship as he defines it. Professor von Heyking brings out the point that a country that is built primarily through immigration over the last several hundred years develops a deep sense of generosity. Everybody is very happy to be here, and everybody tends to be generous to people around them. Now, there are tensions, no question, but we are aligned on those fundamentals of generosity. Anyways, I hope you enjoy this episode. We get deep into political philosophy, all with a view to finding out how we can improve Canada and understand politics better. Thanks for stopping by. John, good to have you back.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me, Shawn.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for making the time. On our last recording, I was listing the classical virtues, the four of them, and I didn't hear it at the time, but in the background, you hollered out, friendship, friendship. And so the classical virtues, wisdom, courage, temperance or self-control, and justice. And then Professor von Heyking throws in friendship in that list. And I was just wondering, were you making a joke? Were you serious? Or to what degree do you include friendship in there?
No, I was quite serious, although it's not an uncontested claim that I'm making. The one thing, I'm thinking of Aristotle here primarily. When he speaks of the virtues, he's creating an image of what the good human being is, or who the good person is. So courage is a characteristic. It's a piece of the puzzle. Moderation is a piece of the puzzle. Justice. He even treats friendship as a piece of the puzzle, not in a kind of comprehensive sense. So Aristotle speaks of friendship both as he devotes 2 books of the Nicomachean Ethics to friendship, which is the largest section. But he only devotes 1 to justice. I'll get to that in a moment. But he actually speaks about friendship or friendliness. He's got a big kind of catalog of friendships early on in book 4, where he talks about magnanimity, magnificence, all these different sort of characteristics that a person has. So he's like a puzzle. Each of these virtues plays a part, but there's certain virtues that play a bigger part that kind of point to the whole of the good human person. And I would say wisdom is one of those. Justice is another one, but I would say actually friendship plays an important role as helping us conceive of what the whole person is. And of course, with friendship, that's a reminder that, yeah, you can say you're friends with yourself, but ultimately it's other regarding. And it's a very important reminder that all these other virtues as well are expressed and take place in a social sphere, in a political sphere, even. So they're not in isolation. Eric Vogelin has this nice way of describing, or he describes this sort of comprehensiveness of friendship, and he mentions wisdom as well and justice. He calls them existential virtues, as opposed to, say, moral virtue or intellectual virtue, which is what Aristotle explicitly labels some of these other virtues. But he speaks of Vogelin speaks of friendship as an existential virtue, and I think by that he means that sort of paradigmatic and comprehensive virtue that expresses when all these other ones are operating. When I teach Aristotle, I'll quite often compare his theory of virtue to like a combustible engine, right? So you've got, say, 6 cylinders, and Aristotle wants all 6 cylinders to be firing. If only 3 are firing, if we're maybe courageous, but we lack moderation or something like that, then we're not really a fully formed human being. And so the image that I use to communicate this to the students is that you want all 6 cylinders firing. And that's what Aristotle means by having these existential virtues in full operational mode.
Yeah, brilliant. So you read my mind. On my notes here, I'd written down, this is a virtue. Well, is it an intellectual virtue or is it a moral virtue? And so then on that idea of what kind of a virtue is it, and this is very crude. I apologize. You teach Aristotle. I try to read them, so this will be too simplistic. But my sense of the intellectual virtues is that they require time and experience. Like you have to actually read lots and lots of books, and eventually you'll develop a mature rationality. You're not born fully rational. Versus the moral virtues, again, oversimplifying it a bit, you have to do things that require courage to develop the virtue of courage. Yeah. So now we have this existential virtue. So is that just something you're born with, or do you actually have to exercise that and develop virtues in that Aristotelian sense? Just like you have to develop intellectual virtue, develop moral virtue.
It's definitely something that requires work. It's intended, it's intentional, needs to be habituated. He speaks, for example, of friendship like virtue is active. You got to work on it. It is a kind of work. And he contrasts that with benevolence, which he describes as inactive virtue. For example, I like you, Shawn. That's benevolence. I'm not going to lift a finger to help you. That's not really friendship, right? So friendship is the deed of actually acting in a friendly way, much in the same way that you're not really courageous unless you've performed some sort of courageous deeds. Aristotle has this great line. He says, you're not just by having the right opinions, but it's in the choices you make. It's the choices you make and the actions you perform is what forms you as a human being.
So I love this. I have to be careful now. I don't get too excited here because I love this topic. So we're basing our discussion, and I'll put a link for this in the show notes, on an essay you wrote titled Friendship and Liberal Democracy for the Ford Leadership Forum, August 2023. And then from other stuff too, but that's what I'll offer for listeners. And right up at the front of that article, you offer a definition of friendship, and you say, I'm going to wreck the pronunciation, I think it's called homonoia or like-mindedness. And how is like-mindedness an active virtue? Like, do I have to choose now to align my mindedness with your mindedness, or can you unpack that for us? How does that fit together?
Yeah, I know, that's a great question. In that essay, I was focusing more on what Aristotle calls political friendship, which I would say is different than this kind of virtue friendship that we were just speaking about. Political friendship you could say, is a lower order. It's not the same level of intimacy. Doesn't require quite the high level of moral and intellectual virtues that virtue friendship requires. Political friendship is the friendship that we, in our role as citizens, share with one another. But just as with virtue friendship, indeed, it is something you got to work at. And it is an active, does have an operational mode, because he regards the activity of citizenship not simply as a kind of identity marker. My passport says I'm a Canadian citizen. That's great. But that's a very kind of passive or minimalist understanding. What Aristotle means by citizenship is a citizen takes part in the ruling affairs of the regime and shares, and by ruling is kind of shares in the honors of that regime too. So he does have a kind of, you might say, participatory democracy kind of understanding of that. It's not simply a marker that gives you certain benefits for membership, but it requires the exercise of certain civic virtues, including things like deliberation, justice, practical wisdom, choice, and these sorts of things. And political friendship, or homonoia, that Greek term that you mentioned, it literally means like-mindedness. And what he means by that is not we citizens share all the same opinions. Right? He says enemies can share the same opinions. We can share the same opinions about scientific matters, about the rotation of the stars or things like that. That is not homonoia. Homonoia is an agreement that citizens share of kind of the fundamental matters of the direction of what their political community ought to do. And so he usually defines it in terms that today we might call constitutionalism. So we agree on the modes by which we choose our leaders. We are sufficiently unified that we can have a coherent foreign policy. We're not a political community where one faction is appealing to our enemies and trying to split us off, things like that. And so it can sometimes be misunderstood as what he means by political friendship or homonoia. He certainly doesn't mean we share all the same opinions. I think a better way of understanding it is we share a common life together that we are actively engaged with together. And in that sense, what we agree upon is that fact, that sort of substratum or that sort of priority of a life lived together. And of course, that in and of itself is going to have its various indicators and markers, right? I've been asked a lot of times over the last few months about the activities of Mr. Trump and the rhetoric of the 51st state and all this sort of stuff. And I guess insofar as there's an upsurge of Canadian patriotism, part of that is because what he says is insulting. And it's an affront to what Aristotle would call our spirited part of our souls, our thumos, that part of our souls that says that, no, we are independent people and we have political freedom that allows us to conduct our politics on our own terms. And that is a kind of homonoia, that sort of reaction.
Yeah, brilliant. So it sounds, and I apologize, I didn't warn you I'd ask this question. So if you think it's a dumb question, just lateral and go on to the question you wanted me to ask. But
that's right. I just answer the ones I hear.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to. But a bit of a nerdy thing I like about Aristotle is he talks about different kinds of knowledge. So he talks about episteme versus techne and phronesis, and even nous, right, as an insight. So you said just now, that this isn't about political opinions. So in my mind, I'm going, so it sounds like you're saying it's not episteme, it's not like book knowledge. Right. And it almost sounds like you're describing more a phronesis or a practical, lived out, experiential kind of applied wisdom. Now I'm putting words in your mouth, and I'm just wondering, have you turned your mind at all to questioning what kind of knowledge is this? Or maybe that's the wrong category. Maybe you can't even put virtue in knowledge categories. Or have you unpacked that at all? Or
yeah, others have written more eloquently about it than I have, but I think you're quite right. Political knowledge is a type of knowledge, and you're right that it is most closely associated with what Aristotle calls practical wisdom, or in Greek phronesis, which is different from technical knowledge or vocational knowledge, as we might call it today. It's different from scientific knowledge, or episteme, as you said, and it's different from this sort of insight noetic knowledge, or nous, that he speaks about. Now, they operate together too. With Aristotle, once you distinguish something, you always have to come back and say, well, here's how it all fits together. But just as a sort of statement, that's what he's referring to. And it's important to keep those distinctions because Aristotle warns us that a lot of damage to politics can happen when you mistake these types of knowledge in the political sphere. So, for example, a common mistake, especially one in our kind of modern age of technology and scientific reductionism and prominence of science, is both to confuse the activity of politics with scientific knowledge or episteme and with technique, or what he calls techne. That's where we get our term techne that's where we get technique. You think of, for example, technocracy, right? The idea that politics should be replaced by rulership by experts who regard political problems as technical problems to be solved rather than inherent, maybe factional divides that require ongoing management or reciprocal justice, right? So once you start conceiving of your task of rulership as one of technical problem solving, then you run into trouble. And it's a form of tyranny.
Yeah.
If it's not restrained. So that's the danger of technocracy. And because in our own age, episteme or science is quite often seen as the legitimating factor of technocracy, there you see that kind of mixture too. Aristotle himself criticizes Plato, partly for that mistake, partly for this idea of philosopher kings. That's nous, that's insight. That's not politics either. So it's a great defense in reading Aristotle of the kind of the dignity of political activity, the dignity of politics as a way of life, which I think is an important message in our contemporary day because there's lots of cynicism. It's very easy. Canadians, Americans, people in Western democracies like to pat themselves on the back that, well, we're much better than our rulers. And in many cases we are, but that can go too far and it can blind us to the moral importance of the political task and political activity. And so Aristotle gives us an account of prudence. It's translated as prudence. That's a Latinized term, but phronesis, practical wisdom, which he defines it at one point as a truth-disclosing activity. In other words, it's not so much an application of practical wisdom. It's not so much a matter of, here's some rules and I'm going to apply it to this particular case. But it's a matter of what is the right thing to do in this specific situation. Mark Twain has this great line where he says, history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so that kind of illuminates not the repeatability of wisdom, but the kind of analogs of situations that come along. And so practical wisdom, if you look at it through that lens, is a kind of, how can I act wisely in this particular situation? I can think of perhaps precedents, but I also have to be attentive to how those historical precedents differ. I can certainly look for guidance. Aristotle says if you really want to learn practical wisdom, you have to learn the lives and the actions of the practically wise, the leading statesmen. What would Abraham Lincoln do? What would George Washington do? Pick your Canadian leaders. Or what would your Pericles do?
You're playing it safe.
Yeah.
And correct me if I've got this wrong. The way I've often conceptualized it in my mind is I often think of phronesis as being contingent and particular. So you're looking at a situation that could be something other than it is. And you have to be a little less dogmatic going into it, armed with knowledge, but aware that there's contingency here. Whereas in techne, but also in episteme, and I'm pronouncing it wrong, there's more the sense of necessity and perhaps even a generalizability of that kind of knowledge. So we could think of definitions versus phronesis being more about application. Is that fair to say?
I think that's a great point. And what it points to is why Aristotle thinks that those modes of knowledge are so dangerous when confused with practical wisdom. Because if you take the techne example, what you're doing is creating an artifact, right? Techne creates an artifact. I build a chair, I build a car, or something like that. And what you're doing there is two things. First, as the artisan, you are taking raw matter and kind of shaping it to a form. I'm not going to say shaping it as a will. He's not that. I mean, that's more of a modern understanding, but you're shaping it to a form. But in politics, you're talking about human beings, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And that's why, for example, modern day tyrants are quite attractive to that kind of modelship. Oh, I can take people like Shawn and use all this scientific method to mold people like him any way I want. Or what's that line? I think it was Mencken who said that you want to replace the demos. You don't like the demos, so they have to be replaced. I don't know if I'm not sure if I got the quote.
No.
And so techne, and you mentioned necessity, what they envision is stopping time.
Yeah.
You know, stopping contingency and saying, this is it, we stopped. And the language of final solutions that we don't like, we know where that goes.
Yeah. And so I'm glad you agree with me. That means that's a good sign. That means I'm on the right side of things here. Yeah. So my next question leading from that then would be, this is something I've been wrestling with, the idea of universals and universalism. And I find that techne and episteme, or scientific knowledge and technology, tend to lend themselves towards definitions, which seem to fit nicely into universals and universalism. I'm suggesting that Mark Carney's book Values is basically a big long exercise in applying universalism to the political sphere. Yeah, technocracy, right. And circling back to your friendship and the discussion we've had so far and the kind of existential virtue that it is, you've said it's more on the phronesis side of things and it's something you have to work at. Therefore, would you say that it really doesn't fit well as a universal? It wouldn't be a universal in itself? Or have you turned your mind to that? Is friendship a universal? Or maybe you don't think universals exist. I think you're a liberal, so you're a universalist. So
I'll answer the friendship question too. Aristotle speaks of human beings as political animals, and part of that is we have propensities in telos, where friendship is one of these existential goods, you might say, that allows us to actualize our humanity. So in that sense, he's a universalist. Doesn't matter whether you're Greek or Persian, friendship is good for you and good for your soul. But he's also, I don't want to say relativist, maybe particularist in the following way, that the types of friendships that the Greeks will enjoy will look a lot different from the Persians. And the main reasons he gives that is that Persia is an empire. And it's ruled by one single despot, emperor, which means that the form, which isn't just limited to this political, but kind of filters throughout the society. The regime incentive is to have friendships that are highly unequal. Paternalistic, you might say. Whereas the Greeks, and maybe focusing on the Athenians, because they have a different type of regime, that's going to look a lot different from the Persians. And so he's not just, so kind of what goes on at the sort of meta level of civilizations or political communities also has a way of replicating itself within the households. So a liberal democracy, which is a regime dedicated to liberty and equality, will experience friendships that are going to be more equal, more easygoing, you might say, more free than what you'd find in the Persian Empire.
Yeah, sorry, I'm cutting you off probably. I'm getting so excited here. But so you've said then that friendship is a universal, but yet we have to understand it in terms of the Greek experience of friendship versus the Persian experience of friendship. So there's a particularity or a specificity to help us understand what this means in this Greek society. And this is my big concern with the Mark Carneys of the world and Justin Trudeau's, or even the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, all these beautiful words, or the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, right? All these beautiful words. But if those words aren't defined within a particular experience of people trying to live them out together in a community, in friendship, as persons, if you will, then those words can be used to justify some really bad things. And that's what makes me nervous of these highfalutin, universalistic type language.
Yeah.
Is that legitimate, or like, where am I going wrong with that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a legitimate concern. A thought that came to mind just now was that throughout the last several hundred years in the Anglo-American tradition, the focus has usually been on the common law as understanding law as an expression of the mores of a society. So it's kind of a bottom-up model, right? As opposed to the French model of legislation, that's the top-down. And I think, I mean, this is a sort of custom versus, or common law versus French legislation is a debate that, of course, Aristotle didn't take part in. But if I had to guess, I'd guess he'd probably lean more towards the former than the latter as a way that's conducive to good government. You have to be very attentive to the customs, the nomoi, as Aristotle would say, of a society. And so that plays into why you got to look at how the Greeks practice friendship, because it's not just what Athenian law says, but it's the customs that have been around and practiced over hundreds of years. And of course, these are also subject to change, but it's more of an evolutionary change than the sort of top revolutionary change from top down.
Yeah. And so this is why I've been saying we need the concept of Canada as a nation, not because we like old stuff and black and white photographs or old bits of legislature, old laws. It's because we need some basis upon which to unpack our understanding of these current debates. Yeah. Otherwise, they're just, Edmund Burke's phrase, he puts it like this: we need to avoid the nakedness and solitude of metaphysical abstraction.
Yeah, we certainly do. We certainly do. Yeah, and there's many critics of the Charter of Rights that regard it as an act of this top-down legislation. And if you think of it as Trudeau's strategy for dealing with Quebec separatism and nationalism, then in a way that kind of shows it to be that way. Couple that with the prominence of judges and kind of judicial activism, then certainly it's a kind of technocratic dream to have that kind of bureaucracy under the Charter of Rights. I think if you dig into the debates over the Charter, you'll see many different voices, right? I think of, for example, former Alberta Premier at the time, Peter Lougheed, who pushed the Section 33 stuff. That was an assertion of the common law model, right? Mm-hmm. Supremacy of Parliament, a Parliament responsive to the mores of the society. In some ways, I sometimes kind of ask, what would Aristotle call Canada? Because they're pretty straightforward. I guess Canada is a kind of constitutional monarchy of some kind. That's hard to justify. So yeah. we're a hybrid in many ways, and I'm not sure if it all makes sense in the end, but maybe that's probably for the better.
Yeah. Tying that back now to the 51st state comment, and you talked about the thumos that's inflamed, and you talked about the responsibilities of the citizen vis-a-vis this notion of friendship. As you said, it involves the hearts and minds united about common fundamental matters. And so now we're applying that now to the polity is now working together to try to structure ourselves in such a way that we can be something other than just reacting to the 51st state. I wanted to get your thoughts on how that whole friendship citizen idea contrasts with the notion of the foreigner. In modern liberal internationalism, we don't like to even talk about foreigners in any sense, right? No one's a foreigner. Everyone's just a fellow traveler in this international global liberal order. And yet, what would Aristotle or what would Professor von Heyking say about the citizen versus the foreigner? And is that it's an anachronism that we should throw out, perhaps?
And I think Aristotle would certainly say that when you eliminate the distinction between citizen and foreigner, that is a kind of act of a particularly democratic understanding of justice. And what he means is that so different sort of partisans make different claims about what justice is. That's the task of the philosopher, to take each of them, say, well, what's true about democracy? What's true about oligarchy? What's true about monarchy? And to take it from there. And so this notion that all people are equal in all things, I mean, Aristotle even goes further. He says that the democratic notion of justice assumes that all bodies are equal. And he leaves it at that. He doesn't, kind of leaves it up to the reader to say there's human bodies, but there's also pig bodies and dog bodies and interstellar bodies. And so there's a kind of hubris that Aristotle sees in democratic understandings of freedom and equality that kind of sees the partisan Democrat claim to justice as an all-comprehensive cosmopolitanism, we call it today. And I think that's certainly an idea that is prominent in many political and social and cultural circles in the world, primarily more on the left than the right. But the problem that the right has always had was trying to draw the boundaries, right? If you think of a conservative as somebody who's in less of a hurry than a liberal, the conservative's challenge is trying to figure out, how slow do I go? Or where do I draw the limits? And with the foreigner versus citizen, that kind of raises the immigration question. Historically, I'm not pointing any fingers to anyone today, but historically, conservative restrictions on immigration have tended to place those restrictions on levels of wealth. You need a certain wealth to come to Canada, which Canada has, at least up until 2019, I think, had fairly high standards for that, higher than the Americans. And B, cultural restrictions. We like immigrants from certain parts of the world more than we like immigrants from other parts of the world. But that can very easily be, people can accuse that, and it can sometimes slide into racism.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, you conservatives, you don't want any brown people, or this sort of stuff. And so conservatives have always had the challenge of trying to come up with coherent ways of restricting immigration against that kind of democratic assertion that all bodies are equal.
And
right. Go ahead.
No, and so you're circling right in on the issue that I was trying to get at. And so you say friendship involves, and this is just a quote from your article, it involves hearts and minds united about common fundamental matters.
Yeah.
And the thing that's been really bothering me recently is all the videos of the protests in Toronto and Ottawa around October. And I think we touched on this last time as well. Is that a demonstration of a difference of opinion amongst friends, or is that an absence of friendship, or are we looking at a failure of the distinction between citizen and foreigner? Are we talking about people who, yes, they're here in Canada, but really everything about them says they're really not citizens of Canada, they're behaving like citizens of somewhere else? And I know these are tough questions. Don't answer any of them if you don't want to, but vis-a-vis friendship, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, where Canada finds itself today, because of very high immigration levels and because of politicians who seek or who are trying to buy votes within various communities, that the politics of the home country or the politics from other countries suddenly becomes the politics here in Canada. And to say it's a problem of excess immigration, I think is only one part of the problem. I think you'd have to look at the activities of politicians who want to inflame that as a way of buying votes as well. Certainly, if you turn the domestic politics into kind of a proxy of what's going on in the old country, then yeah, that's a problem. My own parents came from a destroyed Germany after World War II. And my father, he ended up as a refugee. First thing he did was pick tobacco in southern Ontario on tobacco farms. But he kind of had a choice. He could either do that or work in a mine.
Yeah.
So he picked the tobacco. But he knew people who in the mines. And he tells the story that at one point they got so much into the bickering of kind of the old world that the mine owner said, if you don't cut it out, we're going to send you back. And that stopped.
Yeah. So that's my grandparents' experience in Thunder Bay as well.
Yeah.
They came and they worked in the bush, and one group from the old country would argue with the other group from the old country, and they'd swear at each other in different languages. And yeah, and I think it was Jeff Russ was saying about the Irish immigrants in, I believe it was the 18th century, who brought a whole bunch to Canada, and they started fighting against each other. So yeah, no, tensions aren't new. And to be clear, some of the people, so I have tons of friends who are immigrants as well, just like you have.
Yeah.
And in a way, we're all, most of our ancestors are new to Canada as well. They often bring ideas that are the most passionately patriotic
Yeah.
and nationalistic. They say,
That's
what's wrong with you guys? Why aren't you
yeah.
defending this country?
Yeah.
And
Because they
then
know what the difference is.
yeah, they
Mm.
see value in Canada and they're so
Yeah.
thrilled to be here. They love it and they want to build it and make it strong. And so I see that as a natural linkage of friendship. We both are aligned on the fundamental ideas. And so then I wonder, what is our response as citizens when we see people who, in my mind, I look at these protests in Toronto, like just recently, an ambulance had to turn around. The police turned the ambulance around to avoid the protest. That should not happen. Like I'm fine with saying that is absolutely wrong. In
Yeah.
Canada, we are judged by how well we treat our most vulnerable. If any citizen is needing to be in an ambulance, we should let that ambulance get to the hospital and not
Yeah.
force it to turn around.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm wrestling with. How does the idea of, because I think ideas lead to our behavior or influence our behavior. At least I'd like to think that's true. Maybe it's not always true. How does friendship and the idea of the citizen direct us to act when we see things like ambulances being forced to turn
Yeah.
around? Is there a practical application here?
Yeah, that's a great example that kind of might help us illustrate how Aristotle understands political prudence. Political prudence involves not just this is the good that I'm seeking, but this is how I'm balancing multiple goods. COVID is a great example of the failure to balance multiple goods. But here's another example. So I think as a country like Canada that is populated in large part by immigrants or settlers, as the term is today, that also means that the political culture expresses a high degree of generosity to newcomers, right? There's a reason why people come to Canada and leave certain countries, and those other countries are not accepting people from other parts of the world unless to do slave labor. So Canada has a high degree of generosity in welcoming newcomers, which is sewn into the national psyche. Americans are very similar. Bring us your oppressed and so forth. And I think, and then of course, I think that probably in the example you're citing produces problems because it maybe goes too far in the sense of having too much toleration for civic disorder that interferes with ambulances getting to hospitals.
Yeah.
And so it blinds policy leaders into figuring out how to deal with these other cases. So you have to balance public order. You have to balance that, no, there's certain norms of behavior. We're going to tolerate protests, but those protesters have also got to obey the law.
Yeah. So this connects to another article that you shared with me, and it's titled Democracy's Interest in Kindness, and that was from May 2023. And so I love how you've used the word generosity. I'm wondering if you could unpack a little bit your thoughts around kindness and COVID, because you mentioned COVID in there, and people were using kindness almost as a weapon in both directions. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you have people with buttons on lapel pens, be kind, and this sort of stuff. And it was a bit over the top. So kindness is a term that the Bible tells us to practice. But I think it becomes translated in our contemporary culture as a kind of expressivism, as a kind of performativity, as a kind of cost-free type of behavior that allows you to portray yourself as virtuous at no cost.
Benevolence.
It's not even benevolence, but yeah, I see your point. Yeah, I think what Aristotle says benevolence is having good feelings towards somebody else, but not bothering to put in the effort to help them in any way. Kindness expects you to be a little bit more active, but it is a kind of what Alexis de Tocqueville calls self-interest understood. It doesn't kill me to smile and hold the door open for Shawn. That's just a little gesture. And so I have that essay is a critique of kindness because it is a kind of virtue, but I think that the culture treats it as a comprehensive virtue, which I think it's not.
Yeah, brilliant. A couple of the other, back to your first essay on friendship and liberal democracy, you mentioned the transactional nature of modern political life. And some people would even call it, it's contractarian. John Rawls, the basis of our whole liberal democracy is contract. And I know a lot of liberals, even David Walsh, right, says, oh, no, John Rawls, I don't agree with contractarianism. But yeah. I'm wondering how friendship and kindness and your thoughts on that fit within this liberal notion of a transactional nature of modern politics and maybe even contractarianism. So hopefully I've thrown enough words in there that you can pick whichever direction you want to go.
Yeah. Liberals historically have drawn on a transactional model as the basis of political order. I'm thinking of even before John Rawls, John Locke, right? And after that, there's Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote a book called The Social Contract. It's interesting that I don't think Locke ever uses the word contract. He uses the word covenant. He follows Hobbes. And right there, I think dampens, I mean, there you have the kind of original liberals, at least Locke, who wasn't a liberal. Because covenant for Locke, as it was with Hobbes, means a lot more than a simple transaction. It means a lot more than no-fault divorce. A no-fault divorce isn't even a contract, right? Contracts at least have to be fulfilled. But when the kind of originators of the liberal tradition, like Hobbes and Locke, speak of the covenant, they mean it as a kind of the whole person signs on to it, much like a marriage, right? Beyond marriage, right? The covenant, according to Hobbes, is meant not to end with death, but it's supposed to be eternal. And so I think the last sort of few generations, the transactional model has become fairly popular, largely because maybe libertarians have forgotten these other parts. It's their own tradition. And I think those other parts are more closely aligned with some of the stuff that Aristotle says about civic friendship.
Yeah. And so I want to end with Aristotle. I have one more question for you on him. But before we go there, I wanted to ask you another question about this transactional contractarian notion. We were talking before about the difference between individuals and persons as sort of a basis of our political thinking. And it seems to me that it's hard to have a friendship with an atomized individual. We really have friendships in the sense that we've been talking about with other persons.
Yeah.
And is that fair to say? And if so, how would you see it?
Yeah, the language of individual versus person. A person, I think, suggests something with much more depth than an individual. Individual literally means indivisible. So there's a kind of anthropological claim made with that. And by indivisible, the individual seems to be its own sovereign, kind of like Hobbesian sovereign, self-moving, really not in need of any other individuals. Whereas a person, which has much more depth, infinite depth, you might say, there's an interiority to the person that seems to be much more available in friendship with a person than you might think with an individual. What we're talking about here, individuals versus persons, is kind of semantics. Friendship is, at least as Aristotle understands it, we enter into the interiority of the other, but by doing so, we also share reality together, right? It's not simply I gaze into your eyes and you gaze into my eyes, but it's also through reason, through dialogue, through a life of conversation and living together, he says, we become inseparable because we share a kind of each other's interiority while also sharing a common reality.
So I promised I would have only one more, but now I got two more questions.
Oh, that's
So
fine.
when you said gazing into each other's eyes and blah, blah, blah. So were you critiquing Martin Buber's I thou stuff there?
A little bit, but that's actually the way that C.S. Lewis distinguishes romantic love from friendship love, right? So he says that lovers gaze into each other's eyes, friends stand shoulder to shoulder. Right now,
Brilliant.
that's not all Lewis has to say about the subject. He's got other parts where he says there's some of that gazing into each other's eyes that friends do as well. But just as that, those are always the metaphors that people jump on when they think of C.S. Lewis. My main point is that for Aristotle, when I teach my students, I say Aristotle uses a fairly uncommon Greek term to describe what you might call the peak experience of friendship. The Greek word is synesthesis, mean perception. It's not just visual seeing, but it's intellectual seeing. I live an hour from the mountains, so I'd say it's like you go to Otterton National Park and you love the lovely views of the mountains, but they're not as good as unless you enjoy it with someone you love.
Oh, I like
There's
that.
a depth to the view that comes with sharing it with someone else, right? It's, friends do this all the time. Something neat happens. Hey, Shawn, did you see that?
Yeah.
And that's not just a kind of a passive sort of reference. It's a matter of, it's a validation and a building of a bond between two people sharing that same vision.
Yeah, no, for sure. And actually, even as you're saying that, it reminds me of Alistair McIntyre's book on virtue and how virtue actually comes out of groups of people working towards a shared goal, or even to use your language, united about common fundamental matters. And it's out of that true virtue emerges, and you can actually point to say, yeah, that's what we agree on as being a good behavior as a doctor or as a professor or as a lawyer or as a Canadian citizen. This is what we agree is virtuous kinds of behavior. Yeah.
Yeah, and those kind of those ends, those purposes, of we're responsible to them.
Yeah.
Right.
So here's my last question. You mentioned in your article on the friendship and liberal democracy, you mentioned Aristotle and his thoughts on arriving at a point where we could have true leisure. And I think is the word schole. And so why did you throw that at the end of an article on friendship and liberal democracy? I thought it was brilliant, but I was just wondering, what were you thinking of when you threw in his comments about leisure?
Well, partly because liberal democracies don't have much leisure. There was a time when we had Sunday closing laws, which were Protestant informed leisure, but the Supreme Court got rid of that. But that's neither here nor there. Aristotle's point is that it's very fundamental to what political activity is about, what life in a community is about. And he argues that the purpose of politics is peace. Now, from the Journal of Daw, of course, we know that. However, what he insists on is that you got to know what to do with yourself in peace. Because if all you're doing is preparing for war, or all you're doing is having rest so that you can prepare for Monday to work, that's not leisure. So leisure is not resting, because that's to say that leisure serves work. In the same way that if you're preparing for war, you also have to figure out what it means to win the war, which is peace. And just as with individuals, if you don't know how to rest, and if you're always preparing for work or preparing for war, Aristotle says that's a recipe for degeneration and empire.
Wow.
Yeah. So it has a very important political component. I'll just add that, schole is the Greek, and that, of course, is the origin of our term scholarship. And so for him, leisure is not sitting on the couch and eating potatoes and watching NFL football, which lots of Canadians still love to do. But it's active learning.
Yeah.
And this is fully sort of part of the Judeo-Christian understanding of the Sabbath. In the Hebrew Bible, observe the Sabbath, not that you can rest, that's helpful too, but so you can contemplate God.
Yeah.
And get your life in order.
Yeah. So I love it that you threw that in there, because it reminds us of a purpose or goal or telos for all of our beautiful free market capitalism, industrialism, and building and growth. And yeah, it's not so that we can go out and buy a new iPhone. It's so that we actually get to a point where we actually have some space for true leisure and to contemplate these questions. And so I thought that was really neat to throw that in there at the end of the article.
And it would take a whole other podcast to unpack how a technological society that holds up all these gadgets for greater freedom and greater leisure actually make it harder to obtain.
Yes, brilliant. Brilliant. So I was talking with Grant Havers about George Grant and technocracy, and he's got a book coming out on Marshall McLuhan this fall. Again, looking at technology, technocracy. And I really think there's a lot of runway, there's a lot of opportunity there right now at this moment in Canada where people are feeling anxious and they don't know what to do with themselves, and they blame it on the fact that we can't buy homes or we can't, inflation's too high. I don't know if that's quite the reason why we're feeling yucky. I think it's something deeper.
Yeah, there's a kind of existential restlessness that is deep inside the psyche of modern civilization that is the problem.
Yeah, and that's what Jordan Peterson's really making an empire on, is talking about myth and spirit. And it's like
he's a very busy guy. I don't know how much leisure he gets.
He's marketed the whole thing. People need that. Yeah. So before you go, is there something else we should be thinking about, or a book besides your own books on friendship, or like where should people be thinking next, or what's keeping you awake at night when you think about this topic?
Think about whether political friendship homonoia is a possibility in the Canadian regime. James Mallory, who's a older generation Canadian political scientist, taught at McGill. He worried a lot of whether Westminster-style parliamentary democracy is compatible with federalism. We take it for granted, but out here in Alberta, I'm not sure. I just don't have an answer to that. So we need to really give some serious thought to what that form of our regime is, if it does have a form. On the one hand, we call ourselves responsible government, supremacy of parliament. But on the other hand, what some scholars call the invisible crown, that court party of senior bureaucrats, they seem to be able to convince our government to act in ways that seem contrary to both our charter and our 1867 Constitution. And that's a problem.
Yeah. Right. The other thought that comes to mind for me is that I love ideas, you love ideas. People often right of center love to talk about ideas. And I'm hearing more and more people say, you guys, you lost the narrative a few decades ago. It's not about ideas. It's just about power and manipulating it. And we've lost any kind of civic understanding. I know you have a civics program. You're going to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, power, but for what purpose?
Yeah. Brilliant. John, it's great having you back. And this is fantastic. I'll put links to your essays. And I think it's crucial that we think about this stuff.
Yeah, wonderful. You're doing great work with your podcasts. I'm trying to keep up with listening to all of them, but it's hard. I don't find the time.
Just watch the shorts. The shorts are most popular, right? They're 10 seconds long. That's what people watch. We'll talk to you soon. Don't run away.